Here you have that same sentence, but now alongside a different picture. You've all played, or perhaps you've seen people play billiards or pool, right? Balls rolling around on a table, knocking into each other. Now, as opposed to the magnet, we tend to believe, says Hume, that we would know what would happen to these balls before we ever saw anyone play billiard or pool or saw any balls or any object in motion whatsoever. Hume claims that if we have no experience of the world and we saw one ball approaching another ball, we could not predict that the second ball would roll away. We simply would not know this. There's nothing about the movement of the ball in itself that would tell us, hey, if it runs into another ball, the second ball is going to roll away. We know the second ball is going to roll because we have experience of the world. We've seen things knock into each other, whether they are balls or other entities, it doesn't matter. But the only reason we can predict that ball number 2 is going to roll away because it's hit by ball number 1 is because we have experience of such things happening before. Now, this need not be the exact same thing. It's not necessary that we've played pool. It's sufficient that we've seen things knock into each other. Hume's main point is that this idea, right, if X then Y, if P then Q, whatever letters you want to put there, if we think in those terms, it's only because we have experience of these things happening. In other words, there is nothing in our mind, there's no category in our mind that would be able to predict these things happening if we hadn't first been able to draw up those categories based on our experience. Consider this other sentence from Hume from the same work. He writes, "All that past experience can tell us, directly and for sure, concerns the behavior of the particular objects we observed at the particular time when we observed them." So technically, we should say that, yes, when one ball runs into another ball, the other ball starts rolling away, we want to make that into a general rule. Again, we are pattern seekers and we want to say, if A, then B. But if we want to be precise about it, says Hume, all we can say is that so far, when ball A hit ball B, so far ball B has rolled away. But all that experience tells us is that this has been happening so far. It would be inductive reasoning, as we'll see in a moment. It would be a logical fallacy to assume, based on past experience, that the future will be the same. We have no proof for that. All we have, technically speaking, is just our past experience, and in the past things have always happened a certain way. That's all we can say if we want to at least be truthful. Returning to the Newtonian paradigm, here are Newton's 3 laws of motion in physics. These are very famous, you've no doubt studied them in high school. Now, whether you remember them and can apply them exactly or not is not important here. Even if you've forgotten most of it, you can probably see how that first law, at least, a body at rest will remain at rest, and a body in motion will remain in motion unless it is acted upon by an external force, applies to our pool balls from just now. Balls rolling around will keep rolling around unless they are stopped by the friction, right, with the cloth of the table, unless they bump into other balls. That could be the external force. You can see how that applies. These laws, therefore, give us exactly the kind of patterns and the kind of security that I talked about earlier, that we like so much to get a grip on reality. But where does the confusion lie? We tend to think of laws like these as explanations, whereas in fact they are merely descriptions. What does that mean? Well, you can have these 3 laws, and they can do a really good job of describing, for example, the way billiard balls interact. But the question why remains unanswered. These laws describe what happens, or, as Hume would say, they describe what has happened up to this point, but they don't explain why these things happen. It doesn't explain why motion, why external force. It simply describes, and it does a good job of doing these things within certain contexts, but the question why remains unanswered. Again, traditionally, for an answer to this question why, we have turned to religion. Why? Well, because God has decreed it so, right? Has created reality in this way. With the death of God, which again we're considering here very broadly as the secularization of society and our turn to science, right, as the source of meaning and knowledge, this question why there becomes a problem. Because again, what does science do? Science doesn't explain, but it describes. Another helpful example in this context are financial markets and financial instruments. If you've ever heard an advertisement, for example, an investment bureau or a hedge fund, you have no doubt heard a version of this sentence: past performance is no guarantee of future results. Well, that in a nutshell is exactly life as we know it, according to Hume. Things may have happened in a particular way in the past, but that in no way guarantees them working the same way in the future. Now, we can say this, but we in many cases refuse to believe it. Wishful thinking leads us to think that if we just do what a lot of other people are doing, or what has worked in the past, then we will share in the same results, hopefully positive results, as they did or we did in the past. We do not know this for sure, however. When things have happened a certain way for a long time, this may increase the probability of things happening that way in the future, but we never can be certain. Now, of course, as the financial market crash of 2008 showed us, and other depressions and big financial crises in the past, it's exactly our faith in the future being the same as the past, and us being able to derive predictions from things happening in the past in a certain way about the future. It's exactly this kind of thinking that has gotten us into big trouble. And yet we tend to persist. Why? Again, because we love to think in terms of cause and effect, in terms of reasons. Because it always has happened this way, it is going to be the same way in the future, and that way we have something to rely on. Again, grip on reality that, unfortunately, turns out to be illusory. Now, David Hume takes this kind of thinking very far. He is known as a skeptic, and he does his job thoroughly. He talks about inductive reasoning, again, the kind of reasoning that takes past performance as a guarantee for future results and warns us against it. He even goes so far as to say, look, the sunrise, we expect that the sun will rise again tomorrow. But why do we expect this? Only because it has happened so far every day in the past. But do we have any reason, any logical, any necessary reason that compels us to believe this? No, we don't. It is habit, it is custom. It is also a lot easier to think this way because you couldn't really get much done during your day if you're constantly doubting everything. Hume absolutely grants that, except for he says, you cannot claim to have knowledge where all you have is probability. The movement of the planets, what we know about the stars, scientists tell us that this is how it works, this is why we see a sunrise, all of that is fine, but again, it is description. It does in no way guarantee that the same thing will happen in the future. Coming back to nausea, that form of angst experienced by Roquentin in Sartre's novel, we now see how we can get to the same kind of place, that same kind of existential angst, through the scientific route as well, or through the route of skepticism. This grip on reality we have been talking about, our craving for meaning, right, whether it is in terms of words being applied to things or scientific formulas, when it falls away, when the sources of meaning fall away and self-evidence fall away, we are left helpless. We are left in this state of dread. So those two questions, can meaning exist at all? And if so, how and where? We want to answer those questions. We want to say to the first one, yes, of course. But how do we defend that answer? Do we turn to, for example, religion? Or do we turn to, for example, science? But if paradigms in science shift, and if it turns out that an old paradigm that we were relying on for so long, the Newtonian paradigm, doesn't hold up anymore in the face of contemporary phenomena that we want to explain, and if in addition to that it turns out that our explanations aren't really explanations, whether in the Newtonian paradigm or the post-Newtonian paradigm, then that second question also becomes relevant and very complicated. If meaning exists, how and where? Can we actually answer the question why, or is the best we can do describe things? But if all we have is description, then how does that actually give us that grip on reality that we crave? If all we have is description, we don't really get much further than to say, well, up to this point, or right now as I am witnessing this, it appears to be happening in this way. That doesn't really give us that sense of security that we so badly need.